Okay, I want to talk about solving one-step and two-step and distributive property equations. This is going to be review, at least parts of it are probably going to be review for some people. Some of you are just learning how to solve. So I'm going to kind of go, I don't know, in the middle, right? A little bit slow and a little bit fast, and know that I'm also going to include some notes. So I'm going to attach PDFs of this presentation, so you can always kind of slow down, do it yourself, and use those as notes. So I hope this is helpful. Okay, let's get started. So important things to remember when we are solving equations. These three things are going to be true. So we use inverse or opposite operations to solve equations. Okay, so that means if I have an equation, an x plus 3, say, I want to get that x by itself, so I'm going to do the opposite of plus 3, and I'm going to subtract 3. Okay, so we do the inverse operations. The next thing is whatever we do to one side, we do to the other to keep it in balance. One way to think about that, and one important thing to know, is that the equal sign promises us that both sides of the equation have the same value. So that means whatever we do to one side, we have to do to the other. And the third thing is that our goal is always to get the x by itself on one side of the equation. Okay? Once you get that done, then you know you've solved it. All right, let's practice some one-step addition equations. Now, if they're addition equations, that means that we are going to subtract because that's the inverse operation, right? Okay, so x plus 3 equals negative 2. I have a plus 3, so you can kind of ask yourself, what do we want to do to get rid of that? Well, we're going to need to subtract. Okay, so this suggests that we draw a river. Let me tell you just a little bit about that. The river is a line down the middle of the equation through the equal sign. And the reason that we do that is because, especially when we're just learning how to solve, it's really important that we keep in mind that we have two sides to the equation. And where are those sides divided? Well, they're divided at the equal sign. So we talk about all the time in algebra, one side, the other side, left side, right side, add it to both sides. Both sides of what? Well, the answer is the equal sign. So sometimes we draw a line right down there so that we remember that. Okay, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to subtract 3 from both sides because we know that that's going to help us get the x by itself. And then we're just going to simplify it. So let's see what that looks like. There's the line, the river as they call it. We're going to subtract 3 from both sides. Those 3's are going to cancel out because positive 3 and negative 3 give us a 0. What do we have left on the left side? We have just this x, so we're going to bring that down. And then what do we have on the right side? Well, there's a couple different ways to think about it. We have a negative 2 and a negative 3, right? So if we put a negative 2 and a negative 3 together, since they're both hanging out on the right side, we're going to end up with 5 negatives. The other way to look at it is negative 2 minus 3. Okay? Regardless of how you choose to frame that in your mind, you're going to get the same answer, which is negative 5. So x equals negative 5. Okay. Subtraction equation. So if it's a subtraction equation, we're going to add. Here we go. So we see the x minus 3, and we remember the steps here. We're going to draw the river to separate it and remind ourselves. We're going to add 3 to both sides since it says x minus 3, and then we're just going to simplify. So here comes the river. I'm adding 3 to both sides because I want to get the x by itself, and the way to, who's hanging out with the x? That negative 3. How do I get rid of a negative 3? Well, I add 3. And because this is algebra, I add 3 to both sides. Those are going to cancel. On the left side, I just have an x. And what do I have on the right side? Well, I have two numbers, two integers with different signs. And I need to combine those together. So when I have different signs, remember I'm actually subtracting. So 3 minus 2 is 1. Great. So we know it's going to be some kind of 1. The question to ask yourself is it going to be a positive 1 or a negative 1? Well, the way I like to look at it is I have 2 negatives and 3 positives. I have more positives than negatives. So that 1 will be positive. Positives win on that one. So x equals 1. All right, let's look at some multiplication equation. So if it's a multiplication equation, of course, we're going to divide. There we go. Divide the same number into both sides. So we have 8x equals 32. We want to get that x by itself, but he's kind of busy right now. What's he doing? He's multiplying. So how do we undo that? How do we reverse the multiplication? Well, we divide. We're going to divide both sides by 8. The 8's are going to cancel out, and now we're just left with x equals 32 divided by 8. And of course, 32 divided by 8 is 4, and we're done. Moving right along, here's a division equation. So if it's a division equation, we're going to multiply. All right, and here it comes. We've got x over 3 equals 25. Remember, our goal is to get the x by itself, but right now, he's dividing. So how do we undo division? Well, we're going to multiply. So we're going to multiply both sides by 3. Those 3's are going to cancel out on the left side. And we have x equals 25 times 3, and 25 times 3 is 75, and we're done. Those are one-step equations, right? Because we only had to do one thing. With a one-step equation, we just do one thing. We subtract something from both sides, we add something to both sides, we multiply to both sides, or we divide to both sides. Just one thing, and then we're pretty much done. We're going to move on to a two-step equation, and that means we're going to have to do two things. Don't worry about it, though, because you're going to use what you already know to do these two steps. A two-step is pretty much kind of like doing two one-steps. The important part is that we have to do them in the right order. So the question is, what do I do first and what do I do second? Let's look at the equations as if they are two steps, because they are, right? They're two operations, two things are happening. So let's figure out what those two things are. Let's take this equation. Oh, no, we're not to the equations yet, sorry. The first step will always be either adding or subtracting. Really important to remember. With a two-step equation in the form that we're looking at, the first step will always be either adding or subtracting. We're going to undo addition or subtraction with addition or subtraction. So that means the second step will always be multiplying or dividing. So we're going to be looking for multiplication or division, and we're going to undo it with its inverse. Okay, now we can look at the problem. So what's happening now? Remember, the first thing we're always looking for is where is there some kind of addition or subtraction? And I found it right there. It's plus 5. Okay, so if the first thing that we see there is plus 5, our first step is going to be subtracting. Okay, let's take a look at what our second step might be. So we notice that 8 and x are multiplying. So our second step is going to be division. Okay, let's put it to work now. So here we go. 8x plus 5 is 61. Like we said, we start with either addition or subtraction, right? And so again, I see that this plus 5, and I need to undo that. So the first thing I'm going to do is subtract 5 from both sides. Okay, those 5's are going to cancel out. And what do I have on the left side? Well, I still have an 8x, so I'm going to bring that down. And then on the right side, 61 minus 5. And that's going to give us 56. Okay, so we've done the first step. The first step is adding or subtracting. We've done the first step. We're going to look at the next step on the next screen. Okay, so we have 8x equals 56. And then what do we do next? Well, the 8 and the x are multiplying. So we're going to, I bet you know, divide both sides. Now we have x equals 7, and we're done. We solved a two-step equation. The first thing we did was subtract. The next thing we did was divide. We got that x by itself. Let's try it again. 3a minus 8 equals 4. I want you to ask yourself, where are we going to start? Are we starting with the 3, the 8? We're starting with the 4? Well, we're always going to start on the side that has the variable, which is this. Okay, so, but am I going to start with the 3 or the 8? Well, because I know that the rule is I start with either addition or subtraction, It's going to be the 8, right? Because the 8 is subtracting right now. So the opposite of that is to add. I'm going to add 8 to both sides. 8s are going to cancel. On the left side, I'm going to bring down my 3a. And on the right side, I'm going to add 4 and 8 together. There we go. We did our first step. Okay, we got it down to 3a equals 12. There's still one more operation we have to take care of. That 3 and that a are multiplying. So I'm going to undo that with division. Both sides, I get a equals 4. All right, let's try one more, and it's kind of a different kind. This one has division. I apologize, things are getting kind of cut off down here. But let's look at this original one. M divided by 5 minus 10 equals 15. Okay, so I see that there's this minus 10 happening here, and I need to undo that. So I'm going to add 10, but if I add 10 to the left side, I got to do it to the right side. Those are going to cancel out. And so what I bring down is my m over 5, and 15 plus 10 is 25. So there we are. We're ready for step 2. The m and the 5, those guys are hanging out. They're dividing. So what am I going to do to undo that? Well, I'm not going to divide because that's a division problem, and division doesn't undo division. So I'm going to multiply, the opposite of division. Both sides, those cancel out. 25 times 5 is 125. We did it again. We solved a 2-step. Putting it all together. All right, here we go. Now, before we get started on this one, I want you to look at something, and I did this on purpose so that you won't get too confused, okay? Remember, we're looking for addition or subtraction. Where do we see it in this problem? Because I see 2 minus signs. Which one is actually signifying subtraction? Let's start here. I see a minus sign here, but is that saying that we're going to subtract 4 from x? Because that would be x minus 4, right? So that's not what this is saying. This is not subtraction. This is still multiplication. We have a number right up against a variable, and we know that when we see those two things crowded together that we're multiplying. But who are we multiplying? Well, we're multiplying by a negative 4. So don't get confused. That's not saying minus 4. That's a negative 4 multiplying by x. And the minus 5 is where we're targeting. So we know that if we have a minus 5, we're going to undo that, right, by adding. So we're going to add 5 to both sides. Those 5s are going to cancel out. We're going to bring down our negative 4x. Don't forget the negative. On the left side, we'll have negative 4x. What are we going to have on the right side? Looks like a 16 to me. Okay. Now we're going to divide. And what do we divide by? Now remember, some people might look at that and say, oh, I need to add 4. No, 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 no. Because that doesn't say x minus 4. Okay, that says negative 4 is multiplying by x. What's the opposite? Well, the opposite would be divide by negative 4. And we have to do that on both sides. Okay. Now, hopefully you remember that when we have a positive divided by a negative, our answer will be negative. Okay, so our answer, once those negative 4s on the left side cancel out, is x equals negative 4. Okay. Let's look at equations with distributive property. Okay. So I'm not sure how much experience you guys have with distributive property, but let's let these all slide in and then we can talk about it. Okay. So how do you know when you have distributive property for one? Well, we see these parentheses, right? We see this negative 2 kind of snuggling up next to some parentheses. And we know that when these things are kind of snuggling up, it means to multiply. But I want you to notice the arrows in the next step. So we're multiplying the negative 2 times the x, and then we're multiplying the negative 2 times, I want you to think of this as a negative 7. That's just going to make it way easier. Okay, so that's negative 2 times negative 7 because of that minus. So when I multiply negative 2 times x, I get negative 2x. When I multiply negative 2 times negative 7, I get positive 14. A negative times a negative is a positive, right? And then I bring down my negative 8. Okay. Now you'll notice that it's just a two-step. So really, when we have distributive property, we just have to do a little multiplication and then we're back to the two steps that we're becoming familiar with. So I have negative 2x plus 14 equals negative 8. Because I see that's a plus 14, I'm going to do the opposite and subtract from both sides. These 14s are going to cancel, and I bring down my negative 2x. On the right side, I have negative 8 and negative 14, or negative 8 minus 14, either way, and I end up with negative 22. I divide both sides by negative 2, and I get x equals positive 11. Sorry, that's kind of covered up down there, but you can see it in the notes that I'm going to attach. One more. All right, so 5 times the quantity of negative 2 plus 3 equals negative 45. Let's look at what happened here. So remember that 5, that kind of leading coefficient there, I'm going to multiply the 5 times negative 2x. And then I'm going to multiply the 5 times 3. Don't forget, you have to do both of them. So 5 times negative 2x is negative 10x. 5 times 3 is 15. And then bring down my negative 45. I need to get rid of this first. I'm back to the normal old two-step. To get rid of that, I'm going to subtract 15 from both sides. Cancel. Bring down my negative 10x on the left side. Negative 45 and negative 15 is negative 60. Then I'm left with a one step. I have a negative 10 multiplying by an x. So what do? I divide both sides by negative 10. Again, don't get confused and think this means minus 10. It doesn't. It means divide by negative 10 because that negative 10 is multiplying by the x. And then once we do that, we get x equals 6. And again, sorry about that. You can't see it, but it's there because negative divided by a negative is a positive. Okay, so I hope that's helpful, guys. Again, I'm going to attach the notes, and you can use those, and you can always email me or Mr. Hunter if you get stuck. Okay.